wait, it's thinking. Okay. All right. So first of all, thank you for everyone joining us to this panel/webinar from LightRun. My name is Tom. I run developer relations here at LightRun, and I will be moderating this panel. Today, we have two excellent folks coming to us from HashiCorp and from Shopify, respectively. Before we start, I'm going to let a few people I'm going to let the flood come in a tiny bit, and then we're going to start just to get a sense of what's going on. We're going to do a kind of panel situation where I ask questions, our dear participants answer them, and we'll make sure to talk about interesting cost optimization techniques that they both employ in their own respective organizations. The way this is going to work is mostly a panel situation. We're going to ask questions and get answers, and then at the end we're going to have a nice Q&A session where people can ask specific questions. So if you just joined, click the Q&A button at the bottom to ask any questions on Zoom. If you are on LinkedIn Live, please go over to Zoom and ask questions there, because I cannot see your questions on LinkedIn Live. So let's go to Zoom. We'll wait a couple more minutes and then we'll start. Yeah, grab a coffee, grab a drink, grab a cigarette if you really need it, but nicotine is bad, so don't do that maybe. And then, yeah, let's get this show on the road. Let's wait a couple more minutes and then we'll start. Excellent. I'm going to drink water in the meanwhile. Excellent branded water. That's a branded water bottle we got here.
Oh, there you go.
I can model LightRun bottles. Yeah, sure.
I feel like you should be talking about your swag that you can pick up to support the channel.
So, first of all, we have amazing swag. We have amazing swag. Anybody who's ever seen us at a conference knows that we come all dressed up and with our own theme and stuff. So yeah, we like that. And actually, we're working constantly on creating new ideas, because shirts are awesome, right? Everybody loves shirts. This is a neon shirt. This is dope. But this required some thinking. We took the logo, we manipulated it, we thought about it. Some thinking is going into the swag that we create, folks. Just if you go and get free swag at conferences, know that a lot of thought has gone into it. Yeah. Again, to the people who just joined, I think we're going to start in just 1 minute when everybody will kind of sign up and be ready to go. I think that, yeah, we've got both people on LinkedIn Live, which is awesome, and people on Zoom. To all the people on LinkedIn Live, I suggest come over to Zoom and be able to ask questions. I can see your questions on the networking tab, but it's difficult for me to kind of coordinate between them and Zoom. So I'd really appreciate it if you can ask the questions on Zoom. If you really must, use the LinkedIn Live commentary networking section thingy, and I'll try and put them in. I think we're good. I think we can start. That was enough time to wait. So again, without further ado, thank you everyone for joining us. My name is Tom. I run developer relations here at LightRun. We're a developer observability startup, and among many other things, we do this cost optimization / FinOps / dynamic instrumentation / observability sessions every once / developer productivity sessions every once in a while, where we bring excellent engineering leaders from various leading companies to talk about how they work their magic. Today, I have with me, let me see if I get that right, Mark Cote. Is that right? Did I get that right?
Correct.
Yes.
You're practically French now.
Exactly, from frozen Canada. He came to us via the Thundra to kind of make sure we can talk about cost optimization. Mark leads Director of Engineering Developer Infrastructure, new title. Congrats, Mark, over at Shopify. And we also have Michael from almost as frozen Texas, right? Coming to us from also frozen Texas, who is field CTO over at HashiCorp, correct?
That's correct.
Excellent, excellent. So Michael Wood is Michael, just because I never said the last name.
Sure.
Okay, the way this is going to work is as follows. In just one moment, I'm going to start asking our dear panelists a bunch of questions around the topics that the webinar is about, cost optimization and so forth. But before that, I'm going to throw up a small poll. which I'd like everybody to answer. 3 questions, if you don't mind. It really helps us kind of tune the type of topics you guys want to hear us talk about. And I think that if you answer them, I would be very happy. And other than that, it will help us customize the theme better. So I'm going to throw it up right now. We're going to get, you don't have to actually kind of stop and do it. You can do it while we do the session, but I urge you to do it now if possible. So I'm going to start the poll right now, which is great. I'm going to leave it up for about 10 minutes while we do the discussions. And yeah, so without further ado, let's start asking questions. So first and foremost, bit of housekeeping. We're going to do about 5 minutes of intro, which I just did. The poll was just sprung up. We're going to do then about 45 to 50 minutes of questions, basically where I ask Mark and Michael questions and they answer in their respectable turns. And then at the end, we're going to have 5 to 10 minutes of Q&A, depending on how much questions we're going to have. So I think that would kind of conclude the session. And yeah, I think we can just get started. If you have to drop off in the middle or you kind of have problems watching the session, no problem. Keep in mind that we will both send a recording and this stream will be available live on the LinkedIn Live page for good. So this is for prosperity, folks. So make sure to be on your best behavior, Mark and Michael. And yeah, I think we can get started. Let's do this.
Live for good, permanently live.
Yes. Permanent. Persistence is key. Persistence is key. Always be persistent. So, all right. I'm just going to go ahead and start. Otherwise, I'm going to continue saying nonsense, which is not good for everyone. All right, let's do this. So, first question. 30% of the respondents to the FinOps Foundation's latest survey stated that the biggest challenge for them, is to get engineers to take action on cost optimization. What is your take on that? And before Mark, I'll let you start with the question. I do want to mention to people who don't know, the FinOps Foundation is an industry group which is relatively new, I think maybe a year or two, I'm not exactly sure. And they released a survey that states kind of state of the nation type thing on FinOps in the software industry. So again, 30% of the respondents to the FinOps Foundation survey stated that the major challenge was getting engineers to take action on cost optimization. Mark, what's your take on that?
Yeah, so I guess, I don't know these companies and how they respond, but my experience, getting engineers to do any sort of improvements, whether it's cost optimization or performance or UX or feature bugs, is, it sounds obvious to say, but you have to make it a priority across the company. Developers don't do any of those things as like an extra off the side of their desk, or at least not sustainably. You have to make room for this, and PMs and engineering managers have to know that not as much of other types of work will be done for the duration of a big push. But more specifically from my standpoint and over in developer infrastructure, we see costs that not all teams do. We're like a nexus of development. So we have to bring this to product teams so that they know, for example, tests aren't free, this has a cost, right? Product teams are, of course, incentivized to ship features. And at best, they only see how much their specific services cost, if they even have visibility into that. And so, since we're at the center of the development activity, we see the big picture in, for example, how big our overall CI bill is. And when we see trends of escalating costs, we have to bring them to engineering leadership and to individual teams to figure out how to bring them down. We don't always have the deep knowledge in exactly how our platform is being used, since we make a generic platform, which is why we have to pull in the various engineering teams to work together with them on cost optimization, of them being the subject matter experts in their domain and their services, and us and subject matter experts of our particular platform and services. And of course, the emphasis on cost optimization, like any other quality improvement, you have to keep it up as time goes on. And we're getting better internally at tracking cost metrics and making them part of a decision matrix when new work comes up.
Very cool. Thank you very much for this elaborate answer, Mark. Michael, over to you. Is getting engineers to actually take action on cost is really a big problem? Let us know.
Yeah, I guess one of the things that I toss out there is that if it's available to a developer, then oftentimes developers take that as license. I'll just use it as much as I possibly can, because why not? It's available and it's been approved for my usage. Otherwise, why would I have access to it? So these types of things are kind of the natural progression of the approach. And if you're trying, and really, if you look at developer incentives, the developer incentives are all around coming in under budget and on time, right? I'm talking about speedy delivery. So I'm not really looking at optimizing for cost, which that's going to slow me down and make me think about things that I that get in the way of hitting my bonus targets. So we have to think about maybe some incentive movement there. There's probably something we can do around the incentive side. What we typically start thinking about doing is how can I automate these types of standards? So I maybe use a platform team to vend environments, and you only have certain size environments that are available to you. Or when you're going to vend a database, there's a handful of sizes to the database. And sometimes that leads to a little bit of stress early on because the developers want to be able to change whatever they want to change. But due to cost constraints, we might want to make some decisions early about how we're going to structure the delivery of various services based on their cost, based on their consumption patterns, based on our expectation of load, a handful of things like that. One of the other things that we started looking at, especially as we built out things like HCP, which is the HashiCorp platform, is a centralized automation group that delivers these things where we can sort of centralize things like the audit and the cost assessment. So everything that's going into the environment is coming in through an automated code element. And with that, I can sort of build up a bill of lading and assess an estimated cost for what that's going to run, what the ongoing expense may look like. I may call out to a third-party tool and ask it to assess the environment. And then I want to come back and make policy decisions on, do I allow this to roll forward? And I want to get us very predictive about it. One of the nice things about that is it begins the training of a developer's mindset because they get feedback. They go to push, it pushes, and the automation pushes back saying, this is more than 20% more than the anticipated budget for this use case or something like that. So it's not necessarily that I'm sending them a 600-page manual and saying, hey, in addition to your day job, read this on all the cost policies on every possible service you could consume. That doesn't make a whole lot of sense. I'm not going to get a whole lot of adoption in that case. So maybe I automate it and I prescribe certain elements that are costly. And as the platform team, I can get a sense of feedback of what is costing us a lot of money. Okay, that might be a target for my next iteration of automation, right? What are the proper sizes? How does that fit with most developers? What's the 80% use case? And I can start driving out some automation and some cost policy around it, driving into the platform, make it easy to consume.
I like what you said about vending. Oh, if I could just riff off that for 1 second.
Go ahead.
Around like giving people the kind of a smaller set of choices. If I understood that, like we have an internal
Absolutely.
charter for our developer acceleration group, and we talk about green paths and guardrails, and there's so many advantages to actually kind of narrowing down exactly what we offer and like optimizing for like the global maximum instead of local maximum. I like that.
I think of it also as refining the problem domain that the developer is responsible for. You're just dealing with cognitive overload. You've got way too many options, way too many screws that you can turn and knobs and dials. And okay, well, how do I want the developer focused? If the goal is innovation, I need directed innovation. I don't need just wild. I don't want you being innovative on a WAF, on the bot defense approaches. I don't, don't be creative there. That's going to be out of your hands. Network perimeter. No, I'm not looking for developers to be super creative on the network perimeter. So there are going to be elements that I just want to draw the line and say, sorry, this is outside of the area that I need you to innovate as a developer. You focus on solving business problems, and it looks kind of like this, and here's how we're going to vend your environments to support that mission.
So I really like the counter, the two kind of realms of the problem, or rather the solution that you both present. So one of them would be more on the policy side and kind of the enforcement side, which is where Michael went more. And Mark, you're more about the awareness side of all. So basically getting an engineer to understand that this costs money is not a problem. Getting an engineer to understand how much this costs in practice, and the fact that each of the artifacts that they produce, whether they are tests or compiled binaries, all of that somewhere during the way costs money. That's a kind of maybe a shift from the normal growth mindset of the company. Well, we'll then just invest a bunch of money in order to grow. When we become a bit larger and a bit more responsible towards our costs, we got to also account for that. And I think the logical kind of next step would be, what are indeed some of the best practices you can suggest to encourage engineers to be more cost aware? And Mark, again, let's start with you and see how we can transform this awareness of sorts into concrete action.
One of the things we had, which is pretty, again, straightforward, is just these weekly optimization meetings around certain vendors and costs that we were using that were spread across the company. And the emphasis on these was like on cost optimization, but it was around sharing what we had learned and the improvements and strategies and things so that we could learn from one another and to understand that it's treated as like one of the trade-offs involved, like speed or quality. And so these like discussions became, there would be a representative from any group that was involved in using these vendors that would get together and talk. And again, it's around like these learnings. It's around like putting it into sort of the DNA and get everybody to think about it a little bit. One of the places where I think it's actually kind of tricky, where we don't necessarily have like the perfect answer yet, like we want to be more explicit about costs. Like we're thinking about that and showing developers the cost of their like cloud development instances or production services or whatever, but we don't want people to optimize for the wrong reasons, right? Sort of like what Michael said, if you give them the tools, they're going to use them, but we have to be careful about like, if we show them how much, like we build our infrastructure to be used, and we don't want every developer to think, you know, with the cognitive overload again, I like that as well. You know, should I really spin up this new development environment? We don't want them thinking about that every time they want to share something, right? Calculating the cost of a machine per hour is pretty straightforward, but understanding the impact from, say, prototyping customizable printed receipts, you know, that's less straightforward. And there's a tendency that we have to optimize for an easily measurable metric over something that's harder to quantify. And we want to avoid that as much as possible. So we're still thinking about the best way to expose costs without creating the wrong incentives.
Yeah, I think
Gotcha. Sorry, go ahead, Michael. It's good. It's good. You're riffing on one another. Excellent. Continue.
Yeah, no,
Please continue.
I think that's absolutely brilliant. It's kind of the right way to think about it. The closer that we can get to aligning against organizational KPIs, the better. So if I say this particular company capability, I don't know, produces $10 million in revenue, so the infrastructure spend needs to be within these bounds to ensure profitability of this particular, I'm just making up numbers, whatever the numbers are is what we're going to go with. One of the things that I have been stressing is driving some awareness around what is the cost of a particular best practice. You know, so from an education perspective, it's kind of like, okay, every time you pull down this type of a network control and configure it and provision it, here's the ripple effect cost in audit, compliance, review, architectural, you know, understanding. How many times do you have to share that? Who all do you have to explain it to? What's the operational team that's going to be impacted? All of these things have sort of like ripple effects. And at least at the leadership level, sometimes it's helpful to just say, as you think about your automation, as you think about your application delivery approaches, consider the cost of the best practice that you're looking to. And I want the best practice centered around an outcome, not a tech stack. So I'm not talking about, I think it's much easier for us to calculate the cost of Azure Purview in my environment, or the cost of, you know what I mean, a load balancer, a firewall, something like that, that has a hard cost that the cloud can report out to me on an API call. Those are kind of the simpler things. But oftentimes, because developers are so motivated by speed, they start using things like, well, one example is we were working with a digital media company that was using local KMS for secrets management. It quickly ran up to hundreds of millions of identities under management. And these were high-end encrypted identities. And all of a sudden they look up and it costs them $3 per individual to rotate because they're HSM protected keys and, you know, all these types of things. So now you have a best practice, a desirable best practice, which is to rotate secrets on a regular interval. But every time I do it, it's 100 million times $3 or something. I'm exaggerating the numbers, I think, a little bit, but you get the idea of like, all of a sudden it's like, okay, well, I'm not going to adhere to any best practice with regards to rotating these secrets. It's too costly. You know, it's costing me $1 a month already. So nobody uses that many high-end encryption, but you get the idea. The point is we start doing something because it was easy, it was quick, and I wasn't considering the ripple effects of the cost of that particular best practice. And so I want to ask users to say, just consider the cost of the best practice. If the best practice is not just the issuance of a secret, but easy revocation, rotation on a regular basis, meeting our zero trust expectations for this particular application type, there's more to it than just the infrastructure consumption or what the application developer is asking for. But oftentimes that's at a developer level, and then that ends up or at a leadership level, team lead, PM, you know, like somebody who's driving stories into the backlog. And then that ripples down into engineering on, you know, just think about the ripple effect of what we're implementing.
Yeah, and I find as an infrastructure team that's where costs get externalized to us, and the ripple effect is totally real, because that's where a lot of that happens, is in that infrastructure that they kind of take for granted.
That's right. Yeah.
That's we want them to, for the most part. And it's the best practices is interesting too, because those things can change based on what you're optimizing for. It used to be a best practice that we would run every single test under CI at all times. And then at some point, for a variety of reasons, that became unwieldy. And the new best practice is do selective testing and intelligent test mapping and run as few tests as possible while minimizing risk at the same time. So that's like a new emergent best practice.
That's it, exactly. And as we look at even as we're talking about with Lightrun today on observability, you may be using a particular observability vendor that becomes too expensive at scale. So you had a particular standard, everybody adhered to it, but hey, now we need to change horses. Now, how do I change horses at a low cost? That's another interesting conversation, is when we do need to change horses, am I expecting every team in the whole company to go in and re-implement a new set of APIs? Or is there an automation chain that I can introduce a new thing and I can restage environment? So I also want to think about things like the turnover cost or the change cost, which is an industrial term for, like, you think of a machined assembly line, and we're going to go from manufacturing doors to trunks. What's the cost to remachine the environment to produce a new result? That's the same idea that I want to apply to our automation chains, our CI/CD pipelines, the decentralization of delivery of infrastructure. But we want to think about those so that we can be flexible. When the standard changes, when something new hits us, what does it take to retool? How many people do I got to train? How much audit do I have to, these are kind of ripple effects that I kind of go through when I consider cost of implementing a best practice or a technology or strategy.
Yeah, anybody involved in moving from data centers or cloud vendors, think about that too.
That's right.
So and again, I come from a vendor company, right? So I obviously have an agenda, but speaking of kind of the cost of moving, we always like to look at, and again, we do developer observability, which is, adding telemetry in real time to live applications, which is kind of the counter approach to static telemetry, which is what most like APM and observability players kind of preach today. And usually what happens when we go and start working with a company is we'll actually look at the current state of affairs. So how much logging are you producing every month? What type of logs are you producing every month? Where are they stored? How are they processed? How are they ingested? How are they indexed? How do you query them? And then we'll say, okay, so out of these, how much of these do actually provide you value? And then we end up with numbers which are often very funny. So like 98.5% of logs are never queried. Think about that. Kind of put it into your mind. 98.5% of logs are never queried. That's an insane amount of text to put on a storage device somewhere and then transmit around the internet. So the cost of change, which you mentioned above, we always kind of like to tie it up with what, so there's the cost of like a new vendor or a new workflow or transmitting this knowledge across the entire organization. When you bundle that, when you bundle the cost of change, the actual effort you do, not just the software or the process or something that you're buying, but the actual cost of change, you bundle that into the cost factor. Basically, let's call it the risk of changing, so an adjusted risk factor. And you bundle it into the cost, it's a much easier kind of objection-less approach to implementing a change. When you're bundling in this unknown risk factor into the process, it helps people understand what is associated with making the change as a whole from a decision maker point of view. But I'm digressing. Moving back to the questions at hand, and I loved kind of the back and forth between the problem of awareness, the policy of enforcing it, the actual rate, the actual effort you need to do in order to implement something inside your organization. Love it. Moving back into the more nuanced knowledge you folks have from your own industries. So in FinOps as a whole, and cost optimization, let's say there's cost optimization as a whole, are there different practices between different verticals? So Michael, currently you work for HashiCorp, which is an IAC vendor. Mark, you work for the largest or one of the largest e-commerce software vendors in the world. And Michael, from your own past knowledge, and Mark, from your own past knowledge, are there any different practices between different verticals? So if I'm looking at banking or e-commerce or SaaS or whatever, I'm looking at these verticals and I'm trying to see if there's a major change in how we will do cost optimization. Is there such a difference, or is it mostly the same across all the places? Michael, let's start with you this time around.
Yeah, I'd say most of the core cost elements are going to be the same, very similarly. If I'm talking about protections around my WAF and or network like those are going to be consistent threat models across anything that we're any place that we're dealing with, PII and sensitive information that needs to be encrypted and audited and all that kind of stuff. You're going to have very, very similar standards there. And I want to consider costs in a very standardized way. I think where you'd end up with some differences is at that alignment to the business outcome. So you just end up with, as an example, when I was working with e-commerce vendors, we were looking to increase things like services attached. So you can think of like warranty attached to something that you just bought online. We want to launch a campaign or a new feature which increases the amount of service attached with product sales. All right, so now we're going to experiment against, that anticipated outcome. Well, every percentage that you move that dial is associated with a revenue target. And so my costs need to be aligned against that revenue target. Financial services will have similar kind of KPIs. If I'm talking about like top-down executive view to cost management, but they're just going to be directed at various outcomes, additional number of loans underwritten, it's just going to be a different business KPI, but the underlying cost elements of the cost of change, storage, network, and compute are going to be the same across any vertical. So those types of costs are going to be very consistent. So I'd say it's more about like aligning against a business objective is going to be a little bit different, but the core infrastructure developer costs, productivity gains, all that type of stuff is going to be very, very similar.
Gotcha. And you're basically saying it's less about the nature of the business and more about the nature of the technology associated with the business and the kind of the not deductions, kind of the implications thereof, if I'm getting it correctly.
Yes, and this is kind of where I think this is where companies can really hurt themselves through comparison. So if I start looking at Amazon, and I don't know, let's say I'm a tire company, and I'm looking at Amazon, and I'm trying to operate like Amazon, I don't know that that's the right answer, right? You're a tire company. You don't need to try to match their cost profiles, their team structures. You may be similar in some regards, and your consumption of services may be similar in some regards, but you need to be nuanced enough to recognize when you are trying to do something that doesn't fit your vertical or your business objective. So I try to get customers to take a step back and say, who are we really? What are we trying to do here? And let's align against that and not just, knee-jerk reaction. Oh, Google said this is a good idea, so we're all going to do it. Well, in some ways, yeah, that may be right. There's something there for us to learn. But in another sense, that may not fit with your business model at all. It may be counterproductive. You may spend the next 6 months trying to retrain people to act in a certain way that doesn't add to your bottom line at all. So there's this kind of filtering, I think, that we have to do on practices, technology adoption that I don't think we consider well enough. That's why I keep taking it back up to the KPI. What are you delivering against it and why? Focus your costs on things that are additive to that mission, and don't try to become culturally just like Facebook for no reason. You just, you know what I mean?
Yes, there are fads in technology too, it appeals. But Mark, take it away. Sorry.
I think there's a thread there actually kind of on like history. Every one of these organizations, Facebook, Google, what has their own history, and like you're not going to just leap into where they are. And I said that's the same thing inside of a company, like a department or vertical, whatever that's been around longer. They've had more time to accumulate tech debt. They're probably not actually up to date on the newest best practices that a new vertical starting from scratch with new services or something can implement immediately, right? Like a new team doesn't have as many services to run. So it's a smaller cost like at the moment. It doesn't mean that their area is cheaper to run. They just don't have as many opportunities to have built up cost yet. I mean, I've seen that even in a startup that was not even that old, but they had in terms of developer time, they had built one system. It's not very testable. Their unit tests were almost like non-existent. They had big, expensive integration tests, and making any change to that code base was inherently more expensive than when they started their next project, where they built it in a completely, test-driven development kind of way. And updating that code base was like cheaper in terms of development time and overall calendar time to delivery and everything. And it's just because they learned. And then you have to make that choice of like what's the ROI, how can we align on those KPIs to write part or redesign part of that old product while avoiding second system effect at the same time, and optimizing for a very specific thing and forgetting everything you did right the first time.
Yeah, and I love the comment around like second system. That's a very powerful So I read this blog by a developer. I'd recommend it. It's boringtech.org or something. I'll get the URL and post it after we go live. But he was one of the early developers at Etsy. He was talking about the unintended consequences of adopting technology. So the idea of like, at the time, he said Mongo was the new thing and everybody was saying we need to move to Mongo. And we're like, okay, well, there's a 90% overlap with our current data infrastructure. Yeah, but that 10% is so special. And by the way, look at this use case. This is what I'm talking about. Like, look at this use case where somebody used Mongo to do something amazing. And then, by the way, Mongo's awesome. This is not any kind of critique. All I'm saying is that when I take on a new data technology, what he said is the downstream ripple effects are, I now have an unknown system with unknown failure domains. Like I know exactly how to push over an Oracle, rack cluster. I know we've worked with them long enough. I know exactly how to make that thing fall over. This new thing that I just adopted, I don't know. And I have to retrain my people on how to implement. So I have a training cost. I've effectively taken on 100% increase in complexity, which goes to cost of maintenance and all of that type of stuff. So audit, compliance, resiliency. I don't really understand resiliency. I'm going to trust that their cloud service can handle it. So all of those things are he refers to them in a kind of a Rumsfeld way, like unknown unknowns. We just adopted a bunch of unknown unknowns, and there's cost and risk associated with every one of those unknowns. But we're so excited about the technology. Let's just grab it and go. Those types of things. I think we could be a little bit more deliberate when we consider onboarding a new system or technology and try to assess, does this really materially move our firm forward in the outcome that we've expected, which is kind of why I like that vending approach, because it gives us that standardization piece of like, yeah, we've taken that new technology under advisement. We're evaluating it. Maybe we've got a niche use case we're going to use it on, but I'm not bringing it into the main trunk of IT until all those unknowns have been ferreted out, and I fully understand the cost of adopting that particular technology. Anyway, sorry, long-winded, but
it's
all
just
good.
Once again making me think of those green paths. Exactly, like create those green paths and don't change them unless you have a really good reason to.
Yeah, I completely agree, and specifically, I think you're talking about Dan McKinley from Etsy, and
yes, that's right.
Yeah, choose boring technology. One of my favorite articles of all time. It's a very good article. Talks about innovation tokens. Just Google Dan McKinley, choose boring technology, read it. By the way, for kind of engineering managers starting out, your desire, or rather your kind of the main thing you would go to would be to please your developers with new tech whenever they're coming with a new thing they read on Hacker News or found on GitHub. Major mistake. Try and make sure you do that sometimes, but don't make that the treat for your developers. It's not like a good practice to have as an engineering manager. And I'll put in a small kind of diamond in the rough myself. I used to work for a startup company who did very complicated state-of-the-art technology. I just gave a talk about that company. We ended up getting stuck with what I call the big black Rust box of death, which was a module inside the company that was written in functional Rust. And many of the people who knew how to work with functional Rust, which is an amazing language, I'm a big proponent, it is excellent for many, many, many different things, were not there anymore. So the guy who wrote the thing went away, and we got stuck. It was an SRE. We got stuck with our box. No fun to be had there. So it's good when you're building. It's good when the person building is still there. It's terrible when that person leaves. So please be minded of the people after you and whoever would have to maintain that code. Moving on. So the next question in the session is this. So in the same report from the FinOps Foundation, about 90% of the respondents mentioned that reducing resource waste is a big challenge within FinOps. Now, this is kind of a weird statement to say. So first of all, it might sound like a weird question to ask. So isn't reducing waste a large part of cost optimization? Like, we don't want to waste stuff. However, in a world where everything is ephemeral and virtual, and you're going into an AWS account and just figuring out exactly what's happening with my resources is kind of a problem of its own, it's actually a pretty legitimate question. So I think that, and Mark, I'll let you start on that. What do you think about the fact that simply reducing resource waste, like turning off existing resources essentially, or figuring them out, figuring which one of those are redundant, how much of a problem is that really?
Yeah, I like to think about it bundling waste and complexity together. So it's, I think Michael mentioned the constraints. It's an additional constraint you have to think about when you're designing a solution. And so in our case, like it's much easier to create like a brand new service generally at the beginning anyway, than to find a place for an existing service, in an existing service for new functionality. So like inside of Shopify, right, we have one of the biggest, excuse me, Ruby on Rails monoliths in the world. And we got a lot of smaller services as well. And there have been debates over time around, do we break up the monolith or not? But we decided like, no, we'll make the monolith easier to work on. And it became a priority. You don't create a new service unless you need to. And people would kind of naturally do that, like create a new service, like I don't want to bother go find out where this goes. I got too much other stuff to do, right? And well, that's an increasing cost, and it's one more thing that we have to run instead of just a few more methods inside of an existing service. As another like example, it's a lot easier to write a dumb CI test than a smart one, but that test is going to be inefficient and it's going to cost more money in the long run. And so what those examples have in common is they both increase complexity as well as costs. More services is more money, but they're also, it makes the whole system harder to reason about and creates more points of failure. And badly written tests are harder to debug. They cause other issues in test suites and intermittent failures that are hard to chase down and overall increase like how much you have to think about your cognitive overhead. And so when you're taking the easy path to create a new service, or not spending time to write a very precise and smart test, you're creating complexity that wasn't there, as well as wasting time and money. And people want to take shortcuts, so you have to account to that. So, and I mentioned that like earlier as a developer infrastructure team, we have broad visibility into infrastructure costs, but we also bear some of the weight of that additional complexity in the ways that our infrastructure is used and the extensions and customizations that are asked of us by other teams. So we're regularly asked to support more services, like more complex use cases, and we have to do a lot of internal support, having a lot of like in-house systems designed for our scale and stuff that people come to us for a lot of different things. And so we see all of that, and it's our responsibility to report that up to explain why our costs went up. And then we have to explain that to the developer teams who naturally externalize those costs. And yeah, so they don't get this infrastructure for free, but if everybody's doing their own thing, our job becomes harder. And then all of engineering gets less effective if our developer acceleration can't accelerate in the same way. So by bundling this together, that like you're doing yourself a favor by reducing complexity, you're also going to be reducing costs and reducing waste as well.
Excellent. Thank you very much for the thorough explanation. Michael, when we kind of prepared for this webinar, you mentioned you actually have a great example for this specific thing.
Oh, yeah, I'm forgetting what that example was now. I was interested in the conversation, and I saw the question come in on, we're talking a lot about infrastructure. What about lines of code and code complexity and the costs associated with that? And certainly that's one of the things that microservices approaches seeks to solve, as well as maintainability and easy read. One of the things that made Ruby so accessible and exciting to a lot of developers was the fact that it was very, human readable. It was easier for like a business person to look over your shoulder and understand what the code was supposed to do. So similar to the challenge that you were talking about, Tom, it led to higher degrees of maintainability. If I had somebody just walk out, that Rust example that you were using, and nobody understands anything about how that code runs, finding a way to build code in a digestible, understandable situational way, breaking it into smaller pieces that are easier to understand in the micro. And I focus on that sort of up and down what we're trying to accomplish. So from the code itself, it needs to be easily understood and maintained. This is kind of why back when I was at Pivotal and we were building labs, and I had an opportunity to help with a couple of different labs build outs. A lot of what our focus was on paired programming, test-driven development approaches, user-driven design, kind of all those core best practice extreme development sort of things that made it much easier for me to keep the cost of the code maintainability low. But where we ended up adding complexity was more on, we're not paying too much attention to the services that we're consuming. So the code was very maintainable and sleek. And this is why a lot of my focus now is on the ripple effects of what I'm consuming as a developer, as opposed to, kind of the front end where it's, is the code maintainable? Is it easier to drive the costs out? Those types of things. But Tom, as you mentioned the story, what was the original question? Because I really was catching on to what Mark was talking about and thought I could add a little bit of color there.
No worries. It's best when you kind of go from one end to another. It makes for a more interesting story. So the original question was that in the FinOps Foundation report, 19% of the respondents mentioned that reducing resource waste is a big challenge within FinOps.
Yeah.
And I think you were going to give an example from the past, basically.
Yes. Yeah. So it's actually a Canadian firm. So up in the Great White North with you up there, they allowed, when they first began to move to cloud, they allowed developers to provision all of their own resources, their own development environments, just give them some cloud credentials and let them go. Now, naturally, we've learned since then that that's a security problem. Now you can just social engineer your way into one of those developer desktops and see all our sensitive code and financial information, all that kind of stuff. But before we really had that awareness, the problem was all of a sudden it shot up to tens of millions of dollars a month in development environments. So just developers, why wouldn't I deploy a quadruple XL server instance times 5, to run my use case? Why wouldn't I? It's available to me. You give me access rights and those types of things. And so it was sort of like just kind of what I said before, like if it's available to me, then I have license to use it. Just give it to me and I'll use it. Well, naturally, the way that we needed to go about addressing that brought us to that vending kind of construct. We're going to vend developer environments, and they're going to be within a particular spec. And then we added the policy, basically policy as code. So if anybody familiar with the idea, you've got OPA, we do Sentinel as part of our product set, but there's multiple ways that you can go about implementing policy into your automated pipeline. And it would check to make sure that what you were asking for was within spec. Whether it's a security concern, are you leaving something open to the network? Did you touch anything on, let me check these things before I allow it to just vend. And then that allows us to provide feedback to the developers. And so we're able to take the cost way, way down. So that just real world use case. One of the other things I did want to mention was you mentioned waste. One of the challenges I have with the waste conversation is just like we talked about before, Tom, on like data. I'm not sure what's good data and what's bad data. Sometimes I don't know what good waste is versus bad waste, because sometimes I don't want my auto scaling group triggering every 36 seconds. I probably want a little bit of overhead. That's not wasted. That's not wasted element. It's just, I don't want to so finely tune my environments that they're constantly firing, scaling, and new instances are coming and going out, because there's a cost to that too. I'm mapping new routes, new IPs are coming in, something's being named, the DNS is being invoked. Like all of these things start to happen if I'm doing a lot of super dynamic. So again, we need to be rational about what is waste. Obvious elements of waste are like headless processes. I spun up a hello world, I consumed a handful of things, and I just left it, forgot I ever deployed the thing. Yeah, let's get rid of that. You're no longer at the company. Yeah, shut down their Snowflake credential. These are things that we should be able to catch through some things like automation. But at the same time, I don't look at like a Gartner readout that says 30% of the, whatever it was at the time, $27 billion cloud spend is waste. I have questions on that number. Yes, I have questions on what you categorize as waste versus unused capacity, because I don't want to be tripping a whole bunch of automation all the time. Anyway, a handful of thoughts on waste, developer productivity, cost around their environments, those types of things.
So regarding that, kind of riffing off on what is bad, what is good data, speaking of my numbers from before about like the amount of logging going to waste in essence, let me kind of put another question in. Among the resources that we do consume as technology companies, what is your opinion on utilizing large amounts of storage for logging purposes? So again, bad data, good data, what is it? How do you even differentiate between the two? What if I'm looking at a blob of storage used for logging, how do I discern if I can delete it, if I don't have to delete it, how much time, how often do I roll it? And basically, what would be your ideal solution around utilizing teras and teras and teras of storage just for logging files? And Michael, let's also kind of start with you again, and then we move on to Mark.
Yeah, I'll go quick. I know I'm being verbose on these things. I
must mention that you were literally invited to be verbose. It's literally why you're on the panel. It's perfectly fine. So please continue.
No, but I want to learn from Mark too, since we're talking about this. So yeah, the problem with data and log data is I'm never quite sure what's going to be important when it hits the fan. And so I'm kind of loath to let data disappear if I don't have to. So the way that we were challenged with this is we have elements of telemetry that we feel are extremely relevant, and we're going to put that into like a higher cost storage zone, make it easy to search and you know, that type of thing. And I may try to find a way to, you know, use some kind of low cost data lake type construct where I'll dump all these things on low end storage, kind of slow response times, and then I'll boot up searchable regions via, you know, query on read. So I'm going to stand up some kind of data environment, hydrate it with something relevant out of the data lake, and then run my troubleshooting there. But the challenge is oftentimes I don't want to let too much go, so it becomes more time related. You know, how far out is long enough that telemetry data is no longer relevant to what we're going to be solving today. Maybe I can let some of that stuff go. Yeah, but it becomes a challenge to understand what's important to what I need the log information for. Network intrusions, breach types. How long do I have to keep something? How long do I have to keep all these logs in order to properly conduct forensics on breach that might have happened 6 months ago? Okay, well, that's a challenge. I'm going to need to park that someplace low cost because we're talking petabytes of data. So these are the types of challenges we start running through, and we end up trying to segment data between the things that are as operationally relevant right now versus things that I'm going to use for mining, you know, later.
Great answer. Thank you very much, Michael. Mark, your opinion on utilizing large amounts of storage for logging?
Yeah, so I get my thoughts are sort of attacking from a different angle. Again, going back to like the externalizing costs is a lot of the times developers don't have an idea of how much some of these things cost. So like we use Datadog, we have like certain combinations of metrics and different things like that, and you want to observe everything. But we didn't have a lot of internal education for a while of like what makes these things expensive, what makes them slow, and what makes them expensive is usually the same thing. And so we had to do like an educational effort at some point to be like, yeah, no, when you're constructing your queries and the cardinality of how many like time series you're using, various other things, like this is like what costs money. And if you notice that your queries are taking longer and longer, they're actually also being more expensive. And so we basically just had to, I use that word several times, but it's education of like, this is how we use this, and this is why these things cost money. And so we have to be more, we can track all this usage, we can track it by teams. Again, not necessarily to say you can't do this, but to start conversations. A lot of this stuff is around, we don't have all the context that we need to make all the decisions, especially at the top level, but we need to share these learnings and have these conversations to say like, just tell me about how you're using this. Like, why is your Datadog bill so high compared to this other group? And maybe it's the right thing to do, but if we don't talk about it, we don't make it clear and conscious and deliberate, we're going to have unequal wastage and stuff. And so, yeah, so we've like the production engineering group would have various initiatives to kind of like educate people and say like, this is what these queries are. This is how it's computed. This is how it's stored. This is why it costs money. This is why it's slow. And if you reduce these certain things, you're going to see improvements as well in like your query costs, your query times, as well as like saving costs overall.
Yeah, I love that approach because I think it's kind of an and. We have this broader view of what we're trying to do with log data, the reasons for storage, how much we want to store, at what cost points. That's kind of like maybe CIO level thinking, you know, about what we need to have. Or CISO is going to be interested in how do we conduct forensics, long tail audit, compliance. You know, there's a number of things that I may want to retain these logs for. So once I have that higher level, that's great. Then I'm going to provide these services, make them available for developers, but then I've got to scope those service consumption, which goes exactly to Mark's point. I need to do a lot of education. I need to make sure they're aware of every time they turn this dial, it costs 56 cents, whatever that is, right? And you're turning it 500,000 times a month. So let's think about slowing that down a little bit.
Yeah, so to be honest, I always think of kind of double tapping on what you said about like good and bad data. I think that when you look at resource waste and you're trying to figure out what is considered waste at all, right?
Yeah.
What is considered? So if you mentioned forensics, so it's not. I think it's not just about like keeping the logs for forensics over time, but it's also about, again, what you actually utilize on the day-to-day. So if I'm like logging something, for example, a just-in-case log based on an incident that happened 3 months ago, and that incident doesn't happen anymore because the product use has changed, then that just-in-case log, which again can be emitted hundreds of thousands of times a month, not extrapolates, but kind of, stacks over time, right? So these logs keep on getting emitted, keep on getting put out there, but nobody ever kind of collects them and does PRs to make sure that these logs are removed. So these just-in-case logs are removed once the case is no longer there, right?
Yes.
And I always felt, and kind of my time with dynamic instrumentation taught me that allowing developers to touch quote unquote live applications, or rather connecting them conceptually to the runtime of the application, is super important. And that this pipeline between the developer, the working developer, and the live application is at the core of reducing costs. It's ensuring that they understand what is actually happening with the code they wrote, rather than kind of ship it on a boat, excuse the Docker analogy, and make sure to kind of sit somewhere in the future. Speaking of which, because I think we're a bit short of time, and I do want to leave a bit of time for Q&A. I see we have some questions here. I'm going to ask one last question, and then we're going to do Q&A. So which one should I pick? Okay, I like it. So generally speaking, we talked a lot about what do we need to do to get engineers involved with the costs. We talked about policies, we talked about risks, we talked about a bunch of different things that exist in the world of FinOps, specifically regarding observability and how to get people in good side of the problem at hand. What is the role of observability as an umbrella term in the world of FinOps and cost reduction? And I want to kind of emphasize the question here. So what I'm actually asking is, how much of an impact with implementing observability in the organization, just by implementing it, how would that affect our FinOps and cost reduction efforts? Michael, you can start with this one.
Yeah, I think it's absolutely massive. I think a lot of our cost overruns are just because we just don't see it. We never feel it. It reminds me of Nassim Taleb's book, Anti-Fragile, which is the idea that you need to have feedback. So if anybody heard his story, this particular book, he was talking about, oftentimes we think of an anti-fragile system being a hardened system. And what he says is that's actually the opposite is true. A hardened system becomes brittle. And when it fractures big. It's like safety glass. And so what he's saying is that to be anti-fragile is to be adaptive. It's to feel the effect of something so that you can respond to it. So like a small business owner is very anti-fragile because every customer is material to the owner of the business. And the more abstracted you get from that, the less you understand what's happening. And so I think of that when I talk about things like observability. If a developer feels the impact and can see their costs starting to skyrocket on the use of a particular service, they will address it. They want to be good citizens. They want to make the world a better place. But if I can't provide them the appropriate data when they need it in situ, then they just don't feel it. I don't know what I'm costing. I'm just doing my job. So I love visibility is incredibly important to help enable developers to make good, clean decisions. The challenge is exactly what we're talking about, just at scale. Like at the size of that HashiCorp is, we're talking global. We're talking teams scattered around the globe, and visibility tooling and aggregation and multi-cloud, on-prem, off. We start talking about all of that stuff. You just start talking about, okay, well, what's the cost to deliver that observability cleanly to everybody at the same time?
Excellent. Yeah. Thank you, Michael. Mark, your game?
First, I should riffing on what you said, Tom, too. This become like a bit of a pattern. Is like that feedback loop. I'm still laughing that Michael used like that cognitive overload, because that's cognitive overhead, as we call it, is one of the things in our charter as well. And like our mission as developer acceleration is to reduce that cognitive overhead that everybody has to think about. Like, what is the most important stuff that you should be thinking about right now? Put it in your face. If costs are really low, maybe you don't need to think about it. It's just like a number somewhere that's not going to be relevant to you right now. If it's high, you need to know about this kind of thing. And that feedback loop is the other side of that, a tight feedback loop to give you that information from, you're in your editor, but you're getting information from like real time from production. And that might include costing, could include all kinds of other things. But I think another important thing around observability, and this is something we struggled with a little bit at the beginning, cloud development environments. I love how that became another thread here, because this is all of a sudden a bigger cost, I think, for companies than it was 10 years ago when only like Google had these things. Everybody else just had fixed cost laptops. But having a model, your observability, like having all that raw data of how many machines are running and the cores and CPU usage and RAM usage and all that, that's important, but it's really hard to reason about once you have a big system. So your observability has to incorporate models that reflect your big system as well. So when we had our cloud development environment, we'd look at like all the machines being used, but we're like, is that good? Is that bad? Are things like not like working right? I don't know. There's like thousands of machines. And so once we built an observability model through some kind of custom tooling that reflected how the system's actually used by users, we could reason more about, does this make sense? Is there more waste? And then we can dive into those like details when we know what we're looking for. It's kind of like how Netflix kind of reduces things down to like a small number of easily measurable things that don't really change, and then they zoom in if there are problems detected with that. So I think that different abstractions of your observability that reflect the abstractions in your systems are important for understanding everything.
I think we continue to learn down that path too. So I like Mark's approach is a learning approach. Like I'm gonna do this. I'm gonna see if that telemetry helps us wrangle costs. It reminds me a lot of like we deliver a new feature and customers love it, but our visibility says nobody ever uses it. So it's a completely unused service, but they like it. Okay, well, that's waste, that's complexity, that's maintenance, that's, So the more that we learn, the more we understand what we need to be observing and how we need to be observing, the more intelligent we become about how we reason it over and determine what's good cost, bad cost, what's waste, what's not waste. What do we need to store actively? What needs to be stored passively? A lot of questions.
I really love both answers on observability. I think that basically getting the lens into the problem is 90% of the solution. But we do have only 5 more minutes, and I want to answer some of the questions in the Q&A. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to say the question, and then I'm going to let one of you answer each, just to make sure we keep on both. So let's start with the first one. I get that microservices help focus on high consuming atomic services. That being said, how do we cut costs on monoliths? Mark, I feel as if this question is probably directed at you. I'm gonna assume, having one of the largest monoliths, very widely vocalized the monolith approach. Mark, what do you think about that?
I mean, that's a tough question. There's sadly not a lot of examples of these monoliths with a lot of people writing about them. So we have to kind of invent our own things. I mean, we attack this problem from every layer. So as I mentioned, it's like finding the smart places to put it, because just because you're gonna, not write it in a service and put it in a monolith, you can still put it in like the wrong space, end up adding complexity, which is going to add overall costs. And so understanding, I guess, education again, understanding how this monolith, the principles in which we build this monolith and extend it are important for reducing complexity and reducing costs. Cutting out all that, like a better observability and cutting out things that aren't actually moving your KPIs forward, dead features, things that we just tech debt that's accumulated, right? Like anything else, there's just going to be more of it in a monolith that you can remove over time. But we attack this from the exact opposite side as well, where we have a Ruby and Rails infrastructure team that is focused on the language and the framework, and using different things like YJITs or different implementations of Ruby to increase speed, reduce costs. It's everything. A lot of things can boil down to reducing costs if you're just like smarter about how you do everything. And so we attack this from like the language thing all the way up to like the way that we build our framework, the architecture of the app itself. And there's no one best way to do it. It's everywhere that you can squeeze some cycles out of it.
Okay, great.
A lot of it, I think, falls into like the modernization of the thing. So like if it's costly for me to update, I don't know, I'm thinking of like legacy applications that get lifted and shifted. They're typically going to be in some kind of way too large of an environment. So we start by right sizing the environment. We start by externalizing configs. We start by externalizing data access. These types of things that make that big monolith a huge maintenance nightmare. We start looking at where are we spending all these dollars.
Monetization.
That's right. And then do we just keep modernizing, keep chipping it away one block at a time? Yep.
Thank you very much. Unfortunately, we do have to finish off this discussion because we're almost out of time. Maybe we'll do just a quick fire round. I'm going to ask Steven's questions. Michael, if you're going to give like a short answer, that would be great.
Absolutely.
Does it make sense to not just talk about cost and waste, but that of debt? I assume we're talking about technical debt, but I'm not sure. Looking at what was promised and what was delivered and quantifying that as debt might make things more interesting. Michael, do you have a sense of the debt question?
Yes. Yeah. And that's kind of where I talk about like the cost of a best practice. I'm hoping to encapsulate things like the debt associated with the implementation of the practice. So I want to include debt in my cost calculation along with other elements like risk. So I want risk to be lumped into that cost calculation as well.
Gotcha.
Yeah,
Okay. Thank you very much for. Sorry. Go ahead, Mark.
I was just going to say the
debt
and cost. I mean, debt has interest you have to pay on it, right? Whether that's easily calculatable or not, right? So that debt is just a form of ongoing cost.
I completely agree. And with that, we are going to wrap up this webinar. Thank you very much, both Mark and Michael, for joining us. Mark, any shout out before we finish?
Just check out our engineering blog, especially the developer tooling section of the Shopify engineering blog. Myself and a bunch of other teammates write about everything to do with developer productivity and infrastructure. It might interest some of you out there.
Thank you very much. And Michael, any shout out from your end?
Yeah, my peers and I here at HashiCorp write a blog out on Substack called Declouded Vision, which we dig into a lot of different things, compliance, risk, cost, developer productivity, all of these various elements that go into IT delivery. If you're interested, feel free to check us out there.
Okay. Again, thank you very much, folks, for joining us for this panel. To anybody joining, if you want to learn how to slash your logging bill with dynamic logging, please look at not this link over here, lightrun.com/logging. We will show you how to slash your existing logging bill using dynamic instrumentation and the Lightrun developer observability platform. We have these webinars about once a month, once every month and a half. Feel free to follow our LinkedIn page to get announcements. And yeah, this is streamed currently to LinkedIn Live, and everybody joining will get a link for a Zoom recording, sorry, they can share around. Yeah, it was a blast, folks. Both Michael and Mark are repeat offenders. They have been with us before and hopefully will be with us again for the future. In the future. Thank you very much, folks, and have a great rest of your day, morning, noon, night, wherever you are in the world. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
See you. Thanks.
Bye-bye.